A homeless man helped a lost boy. 24 hours later, his life changed forever. Daniel sat on the cold pavement, his tattered coat barely keeping the winter chill at bay. The city never slept, but for people like him, the invisible ones, life was a constant struggle. He pulled his coat tighter and glanced around, watching people pass by without a second glance in his direction. Then, something caught his eye. A small boy, no older than 7, stood alone at the street corner. He was shivering, his tiny hands clenched into fists. His clothes were clean but slightly wrinkled, and his face was streaked with dried tears. Something was wrong. Daniel hesitated. People rarely responded well to a homeless man approaching a child. But his gut told him the boy needed help. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked slowly toward him. "Hey, kid," he said gently, kneeling to the boy's level. "Are you lost?" The boy's wide eyes darted to Daniel, full of fear and uncertainty. I can't find my dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel's heart clenched. He knew what it was like to be alone. "All right," he said with a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out together." People walked past them, casting suspicious glances. A well-dressed woman even pulled her child closer, eyeing Daniel like he was dangerous. He ignored them. "What's your name, kid?" "Ethan." "All right, Ethan. Where did you last see your dad?" Ethan pointed toward the other side of the busy intersection. "Over there, but I ran when I got scared. And now I don't know where he is." Daniel exhaled. "Okay, no worries. We're going to find him. But first, let's get you somewhere warm." He gently took Ethan's hand, leading him toward a nearby coffee shop, hoping to find a phone or someone who could help. But just as they reached the door, a man nearby shouted, "Hey! Get away from that kid!" Daniel turned to see a stranger glaring at him, phone in hand, already dialing the police. Others started whispering, their judgmental eyes locking onto him. "Wait, it's not what it looks like," Daniel tried to explain. But it was too late. The flashing lights of a police car appeared at the corner, heading straight toward them. The moment Daniel saw the flashing red and blue lights, his stomach dropped. He knew how this would look, a homeless man holding a child's hand on a dark street. No one would believe him. The police car screeched to a stop. 2 officers stepped out, hands hovering near their holsters. The taller one, Officer Reynolds, spoke first. "Step away from the child. Now." Daniel slowly raised his hands, careful not to make any sudden movements. "I'm just trying to help," he said calmly. "He's lost." Ethan clung to Daniel's side, his small fingers gripping tightly onto his coat. "No! He's helping me," the boy cried, looking up at the officers with wide, scared eyes. The second officer, a woman named Torres, exchanged a glance with Reynolds. "Sir, we need you to back up and answer some questions," she said firmly. Daniel took a deep breath. "I found him alone. He said he lost his dad. I was taking him somewhere warm to call for help." "Is that true, kid?" Reynolds asked, his tone softer when addressing Ethan. Ethan nodded rapidly, tears forming in his eyes. Yes. He didn't do anything bad. Despite the boy's insistence, the situation was already spiraling out of control. The small crowd that had gathered was whispering among themselves, their faces full of assumption and judgment. A businessman in a suit muttered, "He was probably trying to kidnap him." A woman gasped, covering her mouth in shock. Daniel could feel the weight of years of being ignored, judged, and underestimated pressing down on him. It didn't matter what he said, people had already decided who he was. Reynolds sighed and pulled out his radio. "We need to take him to the station. Until we confirm the child's guardian, we can't take any chances." "No. He's my friend," Ethan shouted, gripping Daniel's coat tighter. But it was no use. The officers gently pried Ethan away and led Daniel toward the police car. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt the familiar sting of injustice. As they drove off, Daniel stared out the window, wondering if he had just ruined the only chance he ever had to do something right. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Daniel sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands still cuffed to the metal table. He had been through plenty of tough nights, but this one was different. This wasn't just another night of struggling to find food or a warm place to sleep. This was a night that could define him forever. Outside the room, he could hear muffled voices, police officers, a crying child, and a deep, commanding voice that made them all go silent. Then, the door swung open. A tall man in a sleek navy suit stormed in, his eyes burning with urgency. He barely looked at Daniel before turning to Officer Reynolds. "Where's my son?" the man demanded. Daniel sat up straighter. This had to be Ethan's father. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Sir, we were just about to." Before he could finish, the door opened again, and Ethan ran in. "Dad," he shouted, launching himself into his father's arms. The man knelt, hugging his son tightly. "Ethan, I've been looking everywhere for you," he said, his voice cracking. Ethan sniffled and pointed straight at Daniel. "Dad, he saved me. He was the only one who helped me. The police took him away, but he didn't do anything bad." The room fell silent. Ethan's father slowly stood up and turned to look at Daniel, really look at him. The suit, the expensive watch, the powerful posture, Daniel didn't need an introduction. This wasn't just any man. This was Nicholas Bennett, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city. Bennett's gaze narrowed as he studied Daniel, then shifted back to Reynolds. "You arrested the man who helped my son?" His voice was low, dangerous. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't have confirmation of his story. We were acting in the child's best interest." Bennett scoffed. "The child just told you what happened. And from what I'm hearing, none of these concerned citizens even stopped to help him. Except for one man." He gestured toward Daniel. Officer Torres, looking slightly embarrassed, nodded and unlocked Daniel's cuffs. "I'm sorry, sir. We should have handled this differently." Daniel rubbed his wrists but said nothing. He wasn't angry. He was used to people assuming the worst about him. But then, Bennett did something unexpected. He extended his hand toward Daniel. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I owe you my gratitude." Daniel hesitated before shaking it. His fingers were rough, calloused. Bennett's were smooth, strong. Two men from completely different worlds, now connected by a single act of kindness. Then Bennett smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "I think we need to talk," he said. Daniel had no idea, but his life was about to change forever. Daniel sat across from Nicholas Bennett in the sleek, glass-walled office of the police station. The contrast between them was undeniable. One was a billionaire dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, exuding power and control, while the other was a man who had spent years surviving on the streets, wearing a worn-out jacket and carrying everything he owned in a backpack. Yet, at this moment, they sat as equals. Bennett leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I need to know something, Daniel," he said. "Why did you help my son when no one else did?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. He had expected more formality, maybe even a simple thank you and a ride back to the streets, not an actual conversation. He shrugged. "Because he needed help," he said simply. It didn't matter who he was. No kid should be alone like that. Bennett studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Most people would have walked away. But you didn't." Daniel looked down, tracing a faint scratch on the table with his fingertip. "I know what it's like to be ignored," he admitted. "People see someone like me and assume the worst. I didn't want that boy to feel the way I do every day." A silence stretched between them before Bennett spoke again. "You weren't always homeless, were you?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't expecting that question either. "No," he said after a pause. "I had a life before this. A job. A home. But things fell apart." Bennett didn't pry. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "Then let me make you an offer." Daniel's eyes snapped up. "What?" Bennett smiled slightly. "I don't believe in handouts, Daniel. But I do believe in second chances. And I think you deserve one." He tapped his fingers against the table. "I own a lot of businesses. I'm always looking for people with good instincts, people who understand what it means to care about others. You proved that last night." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I want to offer you a job," Bennett continued. "A real one. Not charity, not a favor, an opportunity. You start as an assistant manager at one of my companies. Salary, benefits, a fresh start. What do you say?" Daniel's mind raced. Just 24 hours ago, he had been sleeping under a bridge, invisible to the world. Now, a billionaire was offering him a chance to rebuild everything he lost. He swallowed hard. "Why me?" Bennett's smile widened. "Because when you had nothing, you still chose to be a good man. And that's the kind of person I want on my team." For the first time in years, hope flickered inside Daniel. And for the first time in years, he said yes. 1 year later, Daniel Parker was unrecognizable. Gone were the tattered clothes, the weary eyes, and the weight of survival that had once pressed on his shoulders. In their place stood a man in a sharp suit, confidently walking through the doors of Bennett Enterprises, where he now worked as a regional manager overseeing multiple businesses. It hadn't been easy. The first few months had been a battle. Adjusting to office life, dealing with people who still judged him by his past, and learning the ins and outs of business had been overwhelming. But Daniel had something that many didn't: resilience. He worked harder than anyone, arriving early, staying late, proving himself every single day. He studied, listened, and adapted. And slowly, people stopped seeing him as a charity case and started respecting him as a leader. But Daniel never forgot where he came from. One afternoon, as he sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, he looked down at the streets below, the same streets he had once called home. And that's when he made a decision. He walked into Nicholas Bennett's office and said, "Sir, I think it's time I give back." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to start a program to help homeless individuals get back on their feet. Job training, housing assistance, real opportunities, just like the one you gave me." Bennett leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You really don't forget where you came from, do you?" Daniel shook his head. "I can't. And I don't want to." Bennett nodded. "Then let's make it happen." And they did. Within months, the Second Chance Initiative was born, a program designed to give struggling individuals the same opportunity Daniel had received. It helped hundreds find stable jobs, housing, and a path forward. The news spread. Media outlets covered Daniel's journey from homeless to successful businessman. Former coworkers who had once ignored him now shook his hand with admiration. People who once judged him on the streets now called him an inspiration. But to Daniel, the biggest reward was walking into shelters and seeing hope in the eyes of people who had none, just like he once did. And in his office, framed on the wall next to his business awards, was a photo of him and Ethan, smiling together. Beneath it was a simple note, written in a child's handwriting: "Thank you for saving me." Daniel smiled every time he saw it, because he knew the truth. Ethan hadn't just been saved that night. So had he. Years passed, but the night Daniel Parker found Ethan on the street never faded from his memory. It was the night that changed everything, not just for him, but for countless others who would follow in his footsteps. The Second Chance Initiative grew beyond what anyone had imagined. What started as a small program within Bennett Enterprises expanded into a statewide movement. Homeless shelters partnered with businesses, job training centers opened in multiple cities, and thousands of lives were transformed. And at the center of it all was Daniel. One afternoon, Daniel stood in front of a packed auditorium, preparing to deliver a speech at a charity gala. High-profile investors, business leaders, and former program participants filled the seats, waiting to hear from the man whose story had become legendary. He took a deep breath and began. "Years ago, I was invisible," he said, his voice steady. "I walked the same streets many of you drive past every day, wondering if my life would ever matter again. But one night, because of a small act of kindness, everything changed." He looked out at the audience, spotting Nicholas Bennett sitting in the front row, nodding with quiet pride. "I stand here today, Not because I was lucky, but because someone believed in me when no one else did, Daniel continued. And that's what this initiative is about, giving people the chance to prove they are more than their circumstances. Applause erupted, but Daniel wasn't finished. I used to think that success was about how much you could achieve for yourself, he said, glancing at the framed photo of him and Ethan that now sat on the podium. But I've learned that true success is measured by how much you lift others up along the way. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Daniel Parker, the businessman. It was for Daniel Parker, the man who never forgot what it meant to be lost and found again. And as he left the stage, shaking hands with people who once would have ignored him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because at the end of the day, Daniel had learned one simple truth: light bulb kindness is never wasted. It changes lives, even when you least expect it. Years later, Daniel Parker sat in his office, now overlooking the skyline of the city he once wandered as a homeless man. The world had changed for him, but deep down, he was still the same person who had chosen to help a lost boy that night. The Second Chance initiative had grown far beyond his original vision. What started as a small program had expanded into a nationwide movement, partnering with corporations, shelters, and governments to give people the same opportunity that had saved him. But today was special. There was a knock on his office door. A young man in his 20s stepped in, nervous but hopeful. Daniel recognized that look. It was the same one he had once had when Nicholas Bennett offered him a second chance. The young man cleared his throat. "Mr. Parker, my name is Jason Ruiz. I just wanted to say, I was one of the people your program helped. A year ago, I was on the streets, just like you were. But because of Second Chance, I got a job, got an apartment, and I just graduated from business school." Daniel smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "That's incredible, Jason. And what do you want to do next?" Jason hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to work for you. I want to help people the way you helped me." For a moment, Daniel saw himself sitting in this very office years ago, receiving the same offer from Nicholas Bennett. The cycle had come full circle. He stood up and extended his hand. "Then let's get to work." Jason shook it, his grip firm. And in that moment, Daniel knew this wasn't just his story anymore. It was a movement. As Jason left the room, Daniel turned toward the framed note on his desk, still in Ethan's handwriting. "Thank you for saving me." Daniel smiled. He had saved Ethan that night, but in the end, kindness had saved him too. And the best part? It was only the beginning.